The Grand Senate Chamber of the Threndari Compact had stood for 11,000 years. Its walls were cut from a single asteroid of black quartz, polished until the stars themselves seemed to swim inside the stone. 400 delegate podiums ringed the central floor in ascending tiers, one for every member species of the Compact, each carved with the sigil of a world that had, at some point in its history, bent the knee to a treaty it did not choose. The air recyclers hummed at a frequency calibrated 11 millennia ago to soothe anxious diplomats. It was, by every measure the Compact valued, a place of order. At the lowest tier, farthest from the speaker's dais, stood a single podium that had been added only 9 years earlier. It bore no ancestral crest. Someone in the cartography office had simply etched a circle with a rough outline of continents into the black quartz, because no one had bothered to design anything better. That podium belonged to Earth. The delegate standing there was a woman named Rhea Okonkwo-Vance, 51 years old, gray threaded through black hair cropped close to her skull. Her hands rested flat on the podium's edge, 10 fingers spread evenly, motionless. She had been standing in that exact posture for 6 minutes while the Threndari speaker, a being of iridescent chitin and 7 ceremonial eyes named Dusk Threndar, delivered what he clearly believed was a formality. "The Compact," Vosk said, his translator voice smooth as poured oil, "in its infinite patience, has tolerated the sovereignty of the Sol system for 9 years. 9 years of trade delays. 9 years of your representatives arriving late to sessions that concern species far older and far wiser than your own." A ripple of amusement moved through the tiers. Not laughter, not yet, but the low collective hum of 400 species agreeing without needing to speak. Today, the Compact formally demands the dissolution of the so-called Sol Defense Fleet, the surrender of all Death World-derived weapons research, and the installation of a Compact steward to oversee humanity's continued development. Rhea did not move. She did not blink in any way the chamber's translators could register as significant. Somewhere in the 4th tier, a Kethrali delegate leaned toward his neighbor and murmured something about how humans always went quiet right before they folded. He was not wrong that she had gone quiet. He was wrong about everything else. "You have 1 hour to comply," Vosk said, "or the Compact Combined Fleet, currently holding position at the edge of your system, 4,200 vessels strong, will enforce compliance directly." He allowed himself something almost like warmth. "We would prefer not to. Earth has interesting cuisine. It would be a shame to lose the chefs." The chamber laughed. Genuinely laughed this time. 400 species finding common cause in the death of a nuisance. Rhea let the laughter finish. She had learned, a long time ago, that interrupting a room's laughter only made people remember the joke longer. She waited until the sound thinned into an expectant silence, and only then did she lift her eyes to the speaker's dais. 1 hour, she repeated. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The chamber's acoustics had been designed to carry a whisper to every seat. "That's generous, thank you." Vosk's 7 eyes narrowed in something that might have been confusion. "You accept the terms?" "No," Rhea said. "I'm telling you that 1 hour is more time than we'll need." Nobody in the chamber understood the sentence as a threat. Threats from Earth had a long, tired history of being empty. 9 years of bluster from a species that could barely hold a colony on its own moon. 9 years of a single defense fleet that numbered, by the Compact's most recent intelligence estimate, no more than 211 vessels. 211 ships against 4,200. The math was not close enough to be interesting. Vosk turned back to his notes, already composing the historical footnote in his mind, the one where humanity's brief and irritating tenure among the stars ended not with war, but with a shrug. "Then let the record show," he said, that the sole delegate declined the compact's generosity. "Sergeant-at-Arms, please escort—" "You should check your fleet's telemetry," Rhea said, "before you finish that sentence. There is a particular kind of silence that happens when 400 species simultaneously check the same instrument and find something that should not be there. It does not sound like anything. It looks like everything. 400 heads turning at once toward personal data terminals. 400 expressions shifting through the same 3 stages in the same 2 seconds. Irritation, confusion, and then the 3rd stage, the one none of them had a translator-ready word for, because none of them had needed it in 11,000 years. A Threndari fleet officer's voice cut through the chamber's speakers, patched in from the command deck of the flagship Ilvathrane's Mercy, stationed at the edge of Sol space. Speaker, we are reading power signatures throughout the outer belt. Dozens, hundreds. They were not there 90 seconds ago. They were not there 90 seconds ago, Speaker. I need you to understand that they were not—" The transmission cut out. It did not come back on for 6 minutes. When it did, the officer's voice had lost the register of professional alarm and dropped into something flatter and more honest. "Ships are gone," he said. Not destroyed, gone. The scopes show detonation signatures, but no wreckage, no debris field. 406 vessels of the Vanguard, erased in 11 seconds, and there is nothing left to prove they existed at all. Rhea Okonkwo-Vance had not moved from her podium. Her hands were still flat on the black quartz, 10 fingers spread evenly, unshaken. Somewhere in the chamber, a young Vethic scribe, barely out of his hatchling years, assigned to transcribe the session for the historical archive, realized he had stopped writing. His stylus hovered over the slate, and for the first time in his short career, he understood that he was not recording a diplomatic session. He was recording the last few minutes of an age. To understand what was happening at the edge of Sol space, one had to go back further than the Compact's intelligence services had ever bothered to look. 9 years was not the beginning. 9 years was only when humanity had chosen to be seen. 11 years before Rhea Okonkwo-Vance stood at that podium, a woman named Dr. Imogen Castellanos sat alone in a converted mining facility beneath the Marianas Trench, 7 kilometers of ocean pressing down over her head, and wrote a single sentence in a notebook that would later be classified so far above any civilian clearance that its existence was, for years, denied even to the president. "They will judge us by our fleet. Let them judge us by something they cannot count." The notebook itself was unremarkable. Government issue, the kind stocked by the crate in 100,000 facilities across the country, its cover a flat institutional gray that had faded further under the humidity of a room built to withstand ocean pressure. No one who found it later, cataloging the facility's effects after her death, would have guessed at first glance that it contained the single most consequential sentence written by a human being in the history of the species. That was, in its own way, exactly how she would have wanted it found. To understand why Castellanos wrote what she wrote, it helps to understand what she had seen in the 18 months before she wrote it. The first compact scout vessel to make contact with Earth had not come with weapons drawn. It had come instead with a kind of bureaucratic indifference, far more corrosive than any show of force. A small survey craft, barely larger than an ocean freighter, that had parked itself in high orbit, run a series of standardized assessments, and then transmitted a report back to compact space that would later be leaked in fragments to a handful of governments with the clearance to read it. The report ran to 400 pages. 3 of them concerned Earth directly. The remaining 397 were devoted to appendices comparing humanity, unfavorably, against 41 other species the Compact had encountered at similar stages of development. And in every single comparison, without exception, Earth ranked in the bottom quartile. Not for lack of intelligence, not for lack of resource. The report's central conclusion, translated with some difficulty by Earth's first generation of compact linguists, was almost gentle in its dismissal. Species shows adequate cognitive baseline, but no coordinated strategic culture beyond immediate self-interest. Recommend standard integration protocol. Threat assessment, negligible. Revisit in one standard century if convenient. Castellanos had been given a copy of that report 9 days after it was declassified to her clearance level. She read it twice, made no visible reaction either time, and then, according to the recollection of the one colleague present in the room, asked a single question that none of the political staff in the briefing had thought to ask. "What," she said, "makes them so certain they've seen everything we're capable of building?" No one answered her, because no one else in the room understood yet that it was not a rhetorical question. She was not expressing outrage. She was identifying a gap, a blind spot in an assessment written by a civilization that had spent 11,000 years cataloging threats by the only metric it had ever needed to use, because no species it had encountered in all that time had ever needed to hide anything from it for longer than a decade. The compact measured what it could see. Castellanos' entire career, from that afternoon forward, became an exercise in building something specifically engineered not to be seen. She did not share the idea widely, not at first. The initial proposal she drafted, 11 pages, spare and mathematical, devoid of any language that might have been mistaken for ambition, went to exactly 4 people. A retired admiral who had spent 30 years arguing that Earth's traditional deterrence models were built for adversaries who thought the way humans thought. A systems engineer with a background in autonomous manufacturing who would go on to become the array's chief technical architect. A budget officer whose entire job for the next decade would be making an enormous expenditure disappear inside routine appropriations no one had the patience to audit, and a single member of the sitting cabinet who read the proposal once, in silence, and then asked only how long it would take before anyone outside the 4 of them needed to know it existed. "As long as possible," Castellanos told him, "ideally until it's already finished." The cabinet member, history would later record him only by his initials, at his own insistence, in the limited declassified files that ever mentioned him by name at all, considered that answer for a long moment, then signed the authorization without another question. It was, by any conventional measure of governance, an act of extraordinary trust in a woman he had met exactly twice. When asked about it decades later, in one of the only interviews he ever gave on the subject, he offered an explanation that was almost embarrassingly simple. "She wasn't asking for power," he said. "She was asking for time. Everyone who asks you for power wants you to notice them getting it. She didn't want to be noticed at all. That's usually how you can tell the difference between someone who wants to be seen as strong and someone who's actually building something." The work itself began in a decommissioned research vessel repurposed as a floating fabrication yard, disguised in every filing and manifest as a deep-sea mineral survey operation. A cover story so mundane that no journalist, foreign or domestic, ever thought to look twice at it in over a decade of continuous operation. The first platforms Castellanos' small team built were crude by the standards of what would eventually seed the outer belt. Slow, inefficient, prone to failure in the harsh vacuum conditions they were meant to eventually operate in. She kept every failure. She had a rule, repeated so often among her original 4 engineers, that it eventually appeared, half-joking, stenciled above the fabrication bay door. The failure that teaches you something is cheaper than the success that doesn't. It took 2 years before the design stabilized into something she was willing to commit to mass replication. It took another year after that to solve the problem that had nearly ended the project twice. A targeting architecture capable of distinguishing genuine background stellar debris from a coordinated fleet formation without ever needing to actively scan for one, because an active scan was, in itself, a signature that could be detected. The solution, when it finally came, arrived not from Castellanos herself, but from a 29-year-old engineer on her team named Priya Anand, who proposed borrowing a passive mass differential technique originally designed for asteroid mining surveys and inverting its entire purpose. Castellanos read the proposal, said nothing for almost a full minute, and then told her, flatly, that she had just solved the one problem standing between the project and functioning at all. Anand would later become the array's second-ever chief architect after Castellanos' death, though by then there was very little architecture left to design. The array by that point had learned to build itself. None of this made its way into any public record for years. Earth's political leadership, across 3 separate administrations that inherited knowledge of the program, maintained a discipline about it that surprised even Castellanos, who had assumed, privately, that a leak was only ever a matter of time in a system built on public accountability. It never came. Perhaps because the small circle who knew understood, without needing to be told twice, exactly what would happen to the program's usefulness the moment the wrong ears learned of its existence. Perhaps because there is a kind of secret that people keep well not out of fear, but out of something closer to reverence. An unspoken agreement that some things are worth protecting simply because of what they represent. What the array represented, to the handful of people who understood it fully, was never really a weapon. Castellanos said as much, more than once, in meetings whose transcripts would only surface years after her death. A weapon was a thing you built to be used. The array was something closer to an insurance policy against a specific and narrow kind of arrogance. The arrogance of being measured once, early, and dismissed forever on the strength of that single measurement. She had watched that 400-page report reduce an entire species to 3 paragraphs and a footnote. She intended, quietly and without fanfare, to make certain that no report like it would ever again be the last word on what humanity was capable of becoming. Castellanos was 63 years old at the time, a materials physicist by training, a strategist by circumstance, and by the account of the 4 engineers who worked under her in that first year, a woman who did not raise her voice because she had never needed to. She had watched the first tentative contact with compact scout vessels 18 months earlier, polite, condescending, thoroughly unimpressed. And she had understood something that the diplomats in the room that day had not. The compact did not fear strength. It had never lost to strength. In 11,000 years of expansion, it had absorbed, conquered, or outlasted every fleet that had ever opposed it. Because every fleet it had ever faced had been built the way the compact itself built fleets. Bigger ships, more guns, more hulls, an arithmetic problem solved by whoever had more zeros. Castellanos did not intend to solve an arithmetic problem. She spent the next 4 years, unrecorded, unannounced, funded through 11 layers of shell programs that even Congress never fully traced, building something else, not a fleet, a seed. Self-replicating construction platforms, small enough to hide inside the asteroid clutter of the outer belt, patient enough to sit dormant for years at a time, drawing power from starlight and stone, building, slowly, silently, one platform becoming 2, 2 becoming 16, 16 becoming more than anyone bothered to keep an exact count of. An array that no scanner in the galaxy was designed to look for, because no civilization sane enough to survive its own history had ever built a weapon meant to be ignored for a decade before it mattered. "We are not fast," she told her team, in a recording later recovered from the facility's archive, her voice flat and unhurried even then. "We are not going to outbuild the compact. We are going to outweight them." The engineers under her, 12 of them by year 3, 40 by year 6, called it informally the Long Silence Array. Officially, it had no name at all, because officially it did not exist. Castellanos insisted on that distinction with a stubbornness her team found almost religious. "The day it has a name," she said, is the day someone writes it down somewhere the wrong person can read it. By the time the Compact issued its first formal contact protocols to the fledgling Sol Defense Fleet, 211 vessels, deliberately visible, deliberately unimpressive, built to be seen and dismissed, the long silence array numbered in the low thousands. Not warships, not in any sense the Compact would have recognized. Distributed weapons platforms disguised as debris, drawing on a power architecture Castellanos had spent a decade refining specifically so that it would register to any casual scan as background stellar noise. She died 4 years before Rhea Okonkwo-Vance ever stood at that Senate podium, quietly, of natural causes, in a small house outside Flagstaff, with a view of the desert she had always said reminded her of the ocean floor. Dark, patient, and full of things no one thought to look for. Her final entry in the project log, dated the morning of her death, read only, "Tell them it isn't a threat. Tell them it's an inheritance." With a view of the desert she had always said reminded her of the ocean floor. Dark, patient, and full of things no one thought to look for. Her final entry in the project log, dated the morning of her death, read only, "Tell them it isn't a threat. Tell them it's an inheritance." By the time of her death, the array had already outgrown the small circle that had built it. Anand inherited not just a title, but a discipline, and she carried Castellanos' original stubbornness forward without softening a single one of its edges. New administrations came and went. Each one, on being briefed for the first time, reacted according to a pattern that Anand eventually stopped bothering to predict, because it was always the same 3 stages: disbelief, a long silence, and then a quiet, almost involuntary question about whether it was truly necessary to keep something so enormous, so completely hidden. Anand's answer never changed. She would slide a single laminated page across the table, the same page every time, a printed excerpt of the 400-page report that had started it all. The one that had reduced an entire species to 3 paragraphs and a footnote. She would let the reader finish it in silence. Then she would say only, "This is what happens to the visible." No one ever pushed back after that, not once, across 3 administrations and 11 years. There was a cost to that discipline that rarely made it into any official account, because the people who paid it were never given the chance to explain themselves publicly. Engineers recruited into the program signed away decades of their working lives to a project whose existence they could not discuss with spouses, with children, with the colleagues they had trained alongside before vanishing, by cover story, into deep-sea mineral surveys and long overseas postings that were never quite what they appeared to be. Some of them never saw the array activated. Priya Anand herself was 51 years old on the day of the Sol reckoning, and she watched the engagement unfold from a monitoring station 300 kilometers beneath the Pacific, alone in a room she had occupied in one form or another for over 20 years. She did not celebrate when the Vanguard's 406 contact icons disappeared from the tracking display. She simply reached for a small radio on the console beside her, an old habit, older than the program itself, and turned the volume down rather than off, the way a person quiets a room without wanting it to go entirely silent. Later, when asked by the small internal review board what she had felt in that moment, watching a decade of buried labor finally justify itself in 6 minutes and 40 seconds, she gave an answer that was recorded, verbatim, in a file that would not be declassified for another 11 years. "Relief," she said, "not triumph. I didn't build this to feel triumphant. I built it so that the next person who reads a report like the one that started all of this would have to write something different in the footnote." That was the sentence, more than any other, that the historians who eventually pieced together the full architecture of the long silence array would return to again and again. Not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. It was the plain, unglamorous accounting of a woman who had spent half her adult life inside a windowless room built to hold a secret, and who had never once needed anyone outside that room to know what she had done in order to feel that it had mattered. The technical shape of the array itself, once declassified, surprised even the handful of compact engineers who were eventually permitted to study a decommissioned platform under the terms of the later treaty negotiations. It was not, by any conventional definition, sophisticated. Its power draw was modest by galactic standards. Its individual platforms carried no exotic materials, no technology that violated any principle the wider galaxy did not already understand. What made it unprecedented was not any single component. It was the discipline of its concealment, sustained continuously across 11 years by hundreds of people who had never once broken that discipline, even when it would have been easier, professionally or personally, to do so. There is a particular kind of strength that does not announce itself, because announcing itself would defeat its own purpose. The Compact, in 11,000 years of expansion, had never had reason to develop an instrument for measuring that kind of strength, because every species it had ever encountered had wanted, eventually, to be seen. Humanity's engineers had wanted, for 11 years, the opposite. They had wanted, more than anything else, to be underestimated for exactly as long as it took to no longer matter. Rhea had never met Castellanos in person. The two women's careers had overlapped only briefly in the final 18 months before Castellanos' death, during a series of closed briefings where Rhea, then a mid-level attaché with no public profile of her own, had been selected specifically because Castellanos trusted her capacity for stillness more than her rank. It was Castellanos, in fact, who had recommended her, in a memo 2 paragraphs long, for the diplomatic posting that would eventually place her at that podium on the day the Compact chose to deliver its ultimatum. The memo gave only one line of justification, and it was the line Rhea thought of most often in the years that followed. She does not need to be believed in the moment. She only needs to be right by the time it matters. Rhea had read that line more times than she could count. She had it memorized before she ever set foot on the black quartz floor of the Senate chamber. She thought of it now, standing at her podium, watching 400 species discover in real time that the arithmetic they trusted had been wrong for longer than most of them had been paying attention. The engagement that the Compact's own historians would later call the Sol Reckoning lasted from first detonation to final silence, 6 minutes and 40 seconds. It did not look like a battle. That was the detail that haunted the survivors most. There was no grand clash of fleets, no maneuvering, no moment of climax that a historian could point to and say, "Here, this was the turning point." There was only the outer belt of Sol's system, quiet and unremarkable. And then there was fire. The Vanguard went first, 406 vessels. The Compact's forward scouting element caught mid-formation as they advanced past the orbit of what humans still call Jupiter. The long silence array did not fire in volleys. It fired in a single, coordinated pulse. 11,000 individual platforms, some no larger than a delivery drone, others the size of a small moon in disguise as one, releasing weapons that had been charging on stored stellar energy for the better part of a decade. There was no warning shot. Castellanos had been explicit about that in a note her successors had followed to the letter. A warning shot tells them where you are. We do not want them to know where we are until it no longer matters that they know. Aboard the flagship, Ilvathrane's Mercy, a junior tactical analyst named Sepha Duril watched her console light up with contact icons that had no origin point she could trace. She was 26 years old, 3 years into her first fleet assignment, chosen for this posting specifically because Command believed nothing interesting would happen on it. She had grown up on stories of the Compact's unbroken record, 11,000 years without a fleet-scale defeat, and she had never once considered that she might be the one taking notes when that record ended. "Sir," she said to her commanding officer, her voice climbing toward a register she did not recognize as her own. "Sir, I'm reading. The Vanguard is gone. All of it." I don't have a firing solution because I don't have a source. There's no ship out there. There's no ship anywhere out there. It's just—" She stopped, swallowed. "It's just space, sir. It's just empty space, and it's killing us." The main body of the compact fleet, 3,794 vessels, arranged in the compact's traditional, overwhelming crescent formation, a formation that had broken the will of 19 separate species without a single shot fired, because no one had ever been foolish enough to test it, began evasive maneuvers 11 seconds after the Vanguard's destruction. It did not matter. The long silence array had not needed line of sight in the conventional sense. Castellanos' team had spent years solving a targeting problem specifically so that maneuver would not save anyone. The platforms did not track ships. They tracked mass signatures against a decade-old baseline map of everything that was supposed to be in that stretch of space, and everything that was not supposed to be there burned. Cepha Duril watched formation after formation collapse on her display, not into wreckage, but into absence. Green contact icons blinking out in clusters of 20, 40, 100 at a time. No debris field forming because there was so little left of each vessel that the sensors could not register a wreck, only a gap where a ship had been. She thought, in a detached and horrified corner of her mind, that she would remember for the rest of her life that it looked less like a battle and more like erasure, like someone going through a very long list and quietly striking out every name. By minute 4, the compact fleet's command structure had begun to fracture. Admirals who had commanded pacification campaigns against species with actual warships found themselves issuing orders to formations that no longer existed to receive them. One captain, aboard a cruiser near the formation's rear flank, made the decision to break and run for the system's edge. The first compact officer in recorded history to order a retreat from a battle the compact was, by every metric it had ever trusted, supposed to be winning. He did not make it. Neither did the 11 vessels that followed him. By minute 6, there were 419 ships left of the 4,200 that had entered Sol system that morning. They were not fighting. They had stopped, adrift, weapons powered down, because their sensors could find nothing to shoot at, and their commanders had run out of orders that made any sense. At 6 minutes and 40 seconds, the firing stopped. Not because the long silence array had exhausted itself, not because there was nothing left to destroy. It stopped because Rhea Okonkwo-Vance, standing at a podium on a station 11,000 years old, had received a single line of confirmation on a device no larger than a coin, and had spoken 4 words into a transmitter that only one system in the galaxy had been built to hear. There was a version of this moment, on paper, that had never made it past a planning document. An earlier draft of the array's activation protocol, written in Castellanos' own hand and later revised twice by Anand, had called for total engagement, no hold order, no negotiated pause, the entire compact fleet reduced to the same absence that had already claimed its vanguard. Anand had argued against that draft for the better part of a year before it was finally rewritten, and the argument she had made, preserved in a single terse memo now part of the historical record, was the one that Rhea carried into that chamber without ever having to read it twice. A message received by no one is not a message. Leave enough of them alive to go home and explain what they saw. It was, in its own quiet way, the more difficult decision. Restraint after the fact is a different kind of discipline than restraint before it. It asks a person to stop something already in motion, something that has already proven it can be finished cleanly, and to trust that stopping short says more than finishing would have. Rhea had rehearsed that exact moment more times than she would ever admit to anyone, alone, in the years before she ever expected to need it. She had not rehearsed it because she doubted the array would work. She had rehearsed it because she understood, the way Castellanos had understood, that the 419 ships left adrift in Sol's system were not a tactical afterthought. They were the entire point. A species that erased every witness left no one to carry the lesson home. A species that erased almost everyone and let the rest go left something far more dangerous to an old and confident order than a fleet ever could. A story told by people who had actually been there about exactly how wrong that order had been. Sepha Durrell would tell that story for the rest of her career, and eventually beyond it, in testimony that outlived her own service record by decades. She was not among the 419 who survived by chance. She survived because someone on the other side of an invisible weapon had made a decision, days or months or years earlier, that her survival mattered more than the satisfaction of a complete and total victory. She would spend a great deal of her later life trying to explain that distinction to people who had not been in the room, and she would never quite manage to make them understand it the way she understood it herself. In the 6 minutes and 40 seconds she spent watching absence spread across a display, waiting to find out whether she would be spared or simply be next. "That's enough," she said. "Hold." 419 compact vessels drifted in the sudden quiet of a system that, 90 minutes earlier, its own admiralty had described as beneath serious military consideration. The Vethic scribe in the fourth tier had, by this point, dropped his stylus entirely. He was staring at Rhea Okonkwo-Vance with an expression that his species did not have a formal word for, though if pressed he might have called it something close to reverence, or something close to terror, or perhaps, and this was the possibility that frightened him most, both at once, indistinguishable from each other. Vosk Ilan Threndar's 7 eyes had all turned toward the human delegate. His translator voice, when it finally worked again, had lost every trace of the warmth it carried an hour earlier. "You," he said and stopped, and tried again. "You had this. For how long? How long has humanity had this and said, nothing?" Rhea's hands were still flat on the podium, still steady. She considered the question the way she considered most things, slowly and without the need to fill silence just because silence made other people uncomfortable. "9 years since your first contact team laughed at our fleet," she said. "Longer than that since we started building something you weren't looking for. You spent 11,000 years being obeyed. We spent 11 years being patient." She let that sit. Those aren't the same thing, and they were never going to end the same way. The chamber had gone silent in a way that 11,000 years of protocol had never designed it to hold. 400 delegates, representing 400 species who had built their entire understanding of galactic order around the Compact's unbroken record, sat with the knowledge that the record had just ended, and that it had ended not in a battle they lost, but in a battle they had not known they were fighting until it was already over. "What do you want?" Vosk said, and for the first time in 11,000 years of Threndari diplomatic history, the question was not rhetorical. Rhea looked at him for a long moment. "Not your surrender," she said. "We're not interested in running what you've been running. We just needed you to understand, once clearly, that you don't get to decide what we're allowed to become." She paused. "The 419 ships still in our system. Tell them to power down and hold position. No one else needs to die today. We've made our point." Word of the soul reckoning reached the wider compact worlds within the hour, and by the standards of a civilization built on measured, careful, centuries-long diplomacy, it spread like wildfire through dry grass. On Threndar Prime, in a newsroom that had spent 9 years running gentle, condescending human interest segments about the quaint Deathworld species and its charming, doomed little fleet, a broadcast anchor named Yeleth Koravan sat in front of a live camera and for the first time in her 20-year career did not know what tone to use. The teleprompter in front of her still had the script from the show's planned segment. "Compact fleet to enforce compliance in Sol system. Analysts predict swift resolution." And she had to physically look away from it because the words on the screen had become, in the space of 6 minutes and 40 seconds, a historical artifact of a world that no longer existed. We are, she began and stopped and started again. We are receiving reports, unconfirmed as of this broadcast, that the Compact Combined Fleet has suffered losses, significant losses, in the Sol system. She looked down at a hastily scrawled note someone had pressed into her hand off camera. Her chitin visibly paled beneath the studio lights, a physiological response no editor had thought to cut. 3,781 vessels, she read, her voice thinning with each word, are currently listed as destroyed or unaccounted for. In intelligence offices across a dozen worlds, analysts who had spent their careers filing humanity under low-priority, non-strategic, cultural curiosity pulled old files back onto their screens with hands that, in several documented cases, were shaking. A senior analyst on Kethra-Livor, a woman named Osa Threll, found herself staring at a 9-year-old report she had personally authored, one that had described Earth's defense capabilities as adequate for internal policing, negligible in any compact-scale engagement. She read her own conclusion 3 times. Then she opened a blank file and began typing a new one. And the first line she wrote was, "We were wrong about what we were measuring." It was not panic, exactly, that moved through the compact worlds in the hours that followed. It was something quieter and more corrosive. The particular unease of a civilization discovering that a fundamental assumption, one so old it had never needed to be stated aloud, had simply stopped being true. For 11,000 years, power in the Compact had been countable. Ships, hulls, guns, colonies, numbers on a ledger that every species understood and could compare against every other. Humanity had broken that ledger not by adding a bigger number to it, but by proving the ledger itself had never captured the thing that actually mattered. On a residential level of a Threndari orbital habitat, an elderly Threndari named Ilvet Serona, retired, long past any stake in fleet politics, a woman who had outlived 2 wars and 1 attempted coup, sat in her small apartment and watched the broadcasts with the particular calm of someone who had seen enough history to recognize when something real was happening, as opposed to something merely loud. She did not gasp. She did not call anyone. She simply reached over, picked up a small clay dish that had belonged to her grandmother, and set it gently on the windowsill facing outward. An old Threndari gesture, mostly forgotten by younger generations, meant to mark a day worth remembering when it happened in a person's own lifetime. She did it without ceremony. She did it the way a person breathes. Her grandson, visiting that evening, asked her why the dish was out. She considered the question for a moment before answering. "Because today," she said, "the galaxy found out it had been wrong about something for a very long time. That doesn't happen often. It should be marked when it does." 6 hours after the Sol reckoning ended, Rhea Okonkwo-Vance stood before a very different kind of audience. Not the Senate chamber, but a single camera in a plain gray room, broadcasting on every frequency the Compact's communication networks could carry. No podium this time, no black quartz. Just a woman standing with her hands loosely at her sides, and behind her, nothing but a wall the color of old concrete. "My name is Rhea Okonkwo-Vance," she said. "I represent the Sol system, and by extension, humanity, in whatever capacity the galaxy is still willing to recognize us." She paused, not for effect, but because she was choosing her next words with the same care she chose all of them. 6 hours ago, a fleet arrived at the edge of our solar system with an ultimatum. We did not ask for that ultimatum. We did not want the conversation it forced us to have, but it was had, and I want to be clear about what happened, because I think clarity is owed to every species watching this broadcast, including the 419 crews whose ships are currently drifting, powered down, in our system, alive, because we chose to let them be. "We built something," she continued, not to conquer anyone, not to expand. We built it because 9 years ago, a room full of powerful people laughed at the idea that we might ever be worth taking seriously. And somewhere in that room was a woman who understood that the laughter would eventually stop being harmless. She let a breath pass. It stopped being harmless today. I'm sorry that it had to. I mean that honestly, not as a diplomatic phrase. I am sorry that thousands of your people died today for a decision your leadership made without ever asking whether we wanted this outcome. We didn't. We would have preferred 9 more years of being underestimated. It's a comfortable place to build from. But I want to say clearly what this is not, she said. This is not a declaration of dominance. We are not interested in inheriting the Compact's throne. We've watched, for 9 years, how that throne treats the species beneath it, and we don't want it. Not because we're incapable of wanting it, but because we've decided, as a species, that there's very little worth having at the top of a system built on being counted, measured, and ranked against each other. A pause, longer than the others. What we're offering instead, and it is an offer, not a demand, is a different kind of relationship. One where power isn't the deciding factor in whether a species gets a voice. We have no interest in being anyone's steward. We'd like, eventually, to not need anyone else's permission to exist either. To the crews still in our system, she said softer now, you'll be resupplied and released within 48 hours, under your own power, no conditions attached. To the families of everyone who died today, I have no words that will be adequate, and I'm not going to insult you by pretending otherwise. She looked directly into the camera for the first time since the broadcast began. To everyone else watching, on every world this reaches, we didn't do this to be feared. We did it because we were done being invisible. There's a difference, even if today it might not have looked like one. The broadcast ended there. No music swelled behind it. No graphic appeared. It simply stopped, the way a person stops talking when they have said what they came to say and nothing more. 3 days after the broadcast, on a world called Kesheth that had joined the Compact reluctantly 4 centuries earlier, and had spent every one of those centuries near the bottom of its hierarchy of influence, a small gathering formed in a market square without any official organizing at all. It began with 2 people. By evening it was several hundred, none of them protesting anything, none of them chanting, simply standing together in a kind of quiet that felt, to the few Compact observers who filed reports on it, unnervingly deliberate. An elder Kesheth farmer named Ovan Thalasi, who had never in his 91 years been asked his opinion on anything by anyone above his own village council, stood at the edge of that crowd and without being asked, without any ceremony, knelt down and pressed his palm flat against the cool stone of the square. He held it there for a long moment. Someone asked him later why he had done it. Because for the first time, he said, I believe someone bigger than us might actually mean what they said. He shrugged. The gesture of a man who had spent his whole life being told his opinion did not weigh enough to matter. I wanted to remember the feeling, in case it doesn't last. It was a small thing. It changed nothing about fleet numbers, treaty language, or the 400 podiums still standing in the Senate chamber's black quartz. But it was reported, quietly, in dozens of similar forms, across dozens of worlds that had spent centuries near the bottom of a hierarchy no one had asked them to rank themselves inside of. Not celebration exactly, something closer to permission, the sense that a door long assumed sealed had perhaps been left slightly open. 2 years passed. They were not dramatic years, not in the way the Sol Reckoning had been dramatic. They were slower, messier, the kind of years that never make it into the version of a story people tell each other afterward, because nothing about them resolves cleanly. The Compact did not collapse. It restructured, awkwardly, painfully, the way any institution 11,000 years old restructures when the assumption it was built on turns out to be false. New seats were added to the Senate chamber. Not many, not fast, but more than had been added in the previous 1,000 years combined, as smaller species who had never before been offered a voice found, cautiously, that raising one no longer guaranteed being ignored. Earth built nothing else like the long silence array. That had never been the plan. Castellanos' own notes, declassified in stages over those 2 years, made clear that the array had been built as a single, unrepeatable statement, not the first piece of an arsenal. What Earth built instead were embassies, trade agreements negotiated, for the first time, from a position no one felt the need to apologize for occupying. A research exchange program with 3 species who had, a few years earlier, voted in the Senate to formally endorse Earth's dissolution. It was imperfect. Rhea Okonkwo-Vance said as much, publicly, more than once. "We didn't fix anything," she told an interviewer 18 months after the broadcast, sitting in the same plain gray room, older now, grayer. "We just proved something could be different. Proving it and building it are different jobs, and the second one takes longer than anyone wants it to." She retired from her post 14 months after that interview, quietly, without a formal ceremony, the way she seemed to prefer doing most things. She moved to a small coastal house outside a town that had, until recently, been considered too far from anything important to matter to anyone. It suited her. On a spring evening, one of those evenings where the light goes long and gold before it fails entirely, Rhea sat on the porch of that house with a cup of coffee gone cold beside her, untouched for the better part of an hour. In her hands was an old, worn notebook, its cover cracked along the spine from repeated opening. It had belonged to Imogen Castellanos. Rhea had asked for it after the woman's death, and no one in the program had thought to refuse her. She turned to the last page, the one she had read more times than she could count, the one with a single line written in Castellanos' careful, unhurried hand. "Tell them it isn't a threat. Tell them it's an inheritance." She had told them. She had stood in a chamber built from a single asteroid, 11,000 years old, and told 400 species exactly that, in exactly those terms, and the words had gone out across the stars faster than she could have imagined, and slower than any of it had felt in the moment. Rhea closed the notebook. She did not open it again after that. She set it on the small table beside her chair, next to the cold coffee, and looked out at the ocean, gray gold in the fading light, patient and enormous, and entirely unbothered by anything that had happened above it. There is a thing that people do quietly when something enormous has finally settled into something ordinary. They do not announce it. They do not explain it to anyone. They simply sit with it, the way a person sits with weather, and let it become part of the shape of their evenings. She picked up the coffee. It was cold. She drank it anyway. Somewhere behind her, through the open kitchen window, a small radio was playing a song in a language she didn't recognize, broadcast from somewhere far outside the solar system, carried across the relay networks that hadn't existed 9 years earlier. She did not turn to listen more closely. She did not need to understand the words to know, in some quiet, settled part of herself, exactly what kind of evening this was. Ordinary, which was, she had come to understand, the entire point.